Ever stop and think about how a society, actually stays alive? It's not magic, and it's definitely not guaranteed. It turns out it's a constant, active process. And today, we're going to dig into one of the most powerful ideas about how that whole thing works. So let's really get into this, because it's the heart of the matter. You and I, we're here for a limited time. But things like our language, our culture, they can go on for hundreds, even thousands of years. So how does that even work? How does all the stuff we've built up as a people not just, vanish when we do? All right, to get to the answer, we've got to first look at the problem. And it's a huge one, a problem every single social group has to deal with. You could call it the survival problem. And it all comes down to a really simple, unavoidable cycle.
And here's the thing. It's what a famous philosopher called an ineluctable fact, which is just a fancy way of saying you can't escape it. You've got new members being born who know absolutely nothing, total blank slates. And at the same time, you've got the older, experienced members, well, they're on their way out. This constant revolving door, this turnover, means there's a huge risk that everything the group knows could just be lost.
And that philosopher, his name was John Dewey. Way back in 1916, he wrote this incredible book, Democracy in Education, where he looked this problem straight in the eye. And what's great is he didn't just point out the problem, he offered a really powerful solution. So Dewey's whole argument starts with this idea of a giant gap, a chasm really, that separates the generations. And it's there from the second a new baby is born. And you can really see that gap here. I mean, look at this. On one side, you've got the newborn, the immature. They're not just unaware, they're, completely indifferent to what the group is all about. And on the other side, the mature members. They hold all the knowledge, all the customs, the art, the science, everything. The distance between those 2 points is just massive. And here's the kicker. This problem isn't getting any easier. Dewey was quick to point out that as civilization gets more complex, with all our technology and science and complicated social structures, that gap actually gets wider. Think about it. What a kid has to learn today to just function in our world is way more than what a kid needed to know 1,000 years ago.
Okay, so we've got this massive, growing gap between generations. How in the world do we get people across it? For Dewey, the answer was simple and elegant. We have to build a bridge. And that bridge, he said, is education.
I love this quote because it gets to the real heart of the challenge. It's not just about, dumping a bunch of facts into a kid's brain. The real trick, the real job, is to take a being who was born quite indifferent and somehow get them to be actively interested. It's about sparking that desire to be a part of it all, to contribute. And Dewey broke this down into a really clear 3-step process. Step 1 is pretty basic. You've got to keep the kids alive, right? But step 2 is where it gets interesting. You have to initiate them, get them hooked on the purpose of the group. Only after they're invested can you really move on to step 3, which is transmitting all the skills and knowledge, the what. And this right here is the main takeaway. For John Dewey, education is not just about getting good grades or landing a decent job. No way. It is the only thing a society has to make sure it doesn't die out. It's the literal life support system. Without it, the whole culture, everything that makes the group unique would just stop. So that's the theory. But how did it actually fare in the real world over the last 100 years or so? Well, like with any really big idea, the story is a little complicated. So pretty much everyone's heard of John Dewey, but his big ideas were never really integrated, not in a deep, widespread way, into American schools. But they didn't just disappear either. His thinking was the fuel for what's called progressive education. And you can totally see its influence today in things like inquiry-based learning, where the goal is to get kids to ask questions and solve problems, not just memorize a bunch of facts. That approach got a huge second wind after the Cold War, when everyone was focused on teaching critical thinking. But, of course, not everyone was on board. Like any major theory, Dewey's work got its fair share of criticism. And to be fair, we should definitely take a look at some of the arguments against his ideas. Okay, so a big critique really goes after the foundation of his theory, where our modern minds even come from. Dewey thought our ability to think in complex ways came from doing practical stuff, working with our hands, farming, building things. But there's a whole other school of thought that says, nope, it's the other way around. This theory suggests our minds were first shaped by abstract things like myths, art, and religion.
And from that point of view, language isn't just a tool we invented once we got smart. Language is the very thing that made us smart and allowed us to think in those abstract ways. So we've had over a century of Dewey's ideas floating around, being debated, sometimes used, sometimes not. Why are we still talking about it? What does it really mean for us, right here, right now? I think the most important thing to take away is this. Dewey's idea forces us to zoom out and see education for what it really is. It's not just about school buildings and homework. It's the essential process of societal reproduction. It's not just about making more people. It's about recreating a culture. It is, quite literally, how a society passes on its soul and stays alive. And that brings us to one last really big question for all of us. If we accept Dewey's idea that education is the bridge that carries our entire society across the generational gap, then we really have to ask ourselves, what are we building that bridge with today? What skills, what knowledge, what values are we choosing to put into its foundation to make sure it reaches the other side?